Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to this wonderful, important seminar that webinar we're holding today with Jonathan Schanzer, being sponsored by the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition. Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, a coalition of some almost 200 rabbis who promote unity with Israel by constructively engaging to build bridges between Israel and the Jewish people. Our mission is to promote unity, understanding, and cooperation among Jewish communities of Israel and the diaspora. So with that, this is part of our ongoing series. You can check out our website, zionistrabbis.org. This will be available on there afterwards as well. And to learn more about or to join the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, we invite you to do so. Today, our guest is Jonathan Schanzer, who is the Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. He frequently testifies before Congress and speaks with members of the administration, regardless of what party it is, and testifies and speaks about issues concerning security in the Middle East. Jonathan is widely recognized as one of the foremost experts on Iran, as well as many different aspects of the conflict that exists within the Middle East. His most recent book is called The Gaza Conflict. He's written a number of other books and frequently writes articles, op-ed pieces as well. And I just find that Jonathan's analysis, we had him with us during the summer when the war was going on with Hamas, and his insights were so excellent. Well, he, within a period of record time, wrote a book now about this conflict. And so we're very fortunate that Matt Abelson, our colleague, will be interviewing Jonathan. And let me just take this opportunity to also wish Jonathan a mazel tov. His triplets celebrated their b'nai and bat mitzvah this past Shabbat. I was privileged and honored to be able to officiate. And so, Jonathan, it's great to have you here, and glad to see that all the kugel and other things you had on the bat mitzvah and bar mitzvah didn't hurt you. So good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
To you, Matt, please.
Hi, my name is Rabbi Matt Abelson. I'm on the steering committee for the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition. I want to thank you, Rabbi Weinblatt, for giving me the opportunity to organize this question and answer. So I have some questions I prepared for you, Jonathan, based on your book, which I have read, and a number of the questions come from the book, but some of them are just, have to do with your expertise in the field. So this will be something that's beneficial, I hope, to people who have read the book and people who haven't. And then feel free to ask questions along the way. I'm talking now to the participants, and I'll be happy to include your questions in this Q&A session. So you mentioned the predictable pattern of the outbreak of war in Gaza with Hamas in your book. What are some of the predictors?
Well, first of all, thank you, Rabbi, both rabbis, and all of you for joining today. It's great to be with you. So maybe it's just worth backing up for a second just to explain that, after having watched the war for 11 days and watching it in Hebrew, watching it in English, watching it in Arabic, I saw a huge gap in understanding of the conflict here in the West in particular. And so after taking a breather, I decided to write the book, did it in what was record time for me anyway. The goal was really to begin to start the debate. And I think core to this debate is exactly the question that you ask, Rabbi, which is how do we understand how these conflicts erupt? And the answer is actually fairly simple. Hamas is always preparing for the next round of conflict. At the end of any of the conflicts that we've seen, and there have been 4 of them, at the end of every one, we've seen Hamas go back and start to replenish its rocket stores and weapons and tunnels. The preparations for war against Israel are constant in the Gaza Strip. And so are the preparations on the Israeli side for responding to Hamas aggression. So right now, as we speak, Hamas is replenishing its rocket stores. It's building new tunnels. It's preparing new drones, all with the idea that there will be another conflict in another 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. We don't know. Meanwhile, Israel is tracking their activities, and it is accruing what they describe as a target bank. This is a bank of targets that are legally approved by the IDF, by the Israel Defense Forces, as well as Israel's Ministry of Justice. And the idea is that when war does erupt, and inevitably there will be another, that there will be legal targets to strike right away. And that actually gets to one of the core misunderstandings of the conflict that continues to occur between Israel and Hamas. And that is that when these wars erupt, it's often alleged that it's just both sides lashing out at one another, when in fact, it's one side that is firing rockets blindly into Israel. These are unguided rockets that Hamas has in the hope of hitting something, a civilian target, a military target, whereas Israel responds with these pre-approved targets using surgical weapons, precision weapons, to strike what has already been determined in advance is of value to the IDF. Now, this goes on with the unguided rockets flying into Israel, usually being neutralized by Iron Dome. Israel responds with these surgical strikes, taking great care not to kill civilians, taking great care not to incur any kind of unexpected damage. And at a certain point, Israel runs out of targets. And at a certain point, Hamas starts to run out of rockets. And that's when you begin to see the cadence of these conflicts begin to dwindle. And it's at that point that Egypt or the United States or the Europeans or the UN, they inject themselves into the middle of the conflict. They try to broker a ceasefire. The ceasefire invariably is not a permanent one. It's not an end of conflict kind of ceasefire. It's a temporary one. And then we go back to quiet while Hamas rebuilds those rocket stores. Israel replenishes its target bank, and the cycle starts over again. But it's all, unfortunately, very predictable. And I think that these cycles, if you will, are often not read properly by our media or by those who watch the Arab-Israeli conflict in general.
So what hope is there that this won't happen again?
There's not a lot of hope, unfortunately. But there are, I think, some things that we probably can do to try to mitigate some of the challenges. One is that the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which is a rival of Hamas, is weak, and we need to make it stronger. It needs to emerge as the clear leader within the Palestinian political spectrum. It's not right now. Hamas is, I think, the stronger party, certainly after the most recent war. But in general, I think it's hard to assert that the PA in the West Bank is the more successful of the two. It's led by a guy who's now entering the 16th year of his 4-year term. That's, of course, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. He's in his 80s. He's not well. He's not a strong leader. And so it's very hard for anyone to kind of point to him as a success story, certainly relative to Hamas, which is, I think, more of a dynamic organization. And certainly its rhetoric is fiery and appeals to the youth of both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So I think, job one is to try to weaken Hamas by strengthening the Palestinian Authority. The second thing is that Hamas only exists because its patrons wish it to exist. And there, I think it's important to raise the fact that there are 4 countries in particular that I note in the book that are the primary patrons of Hamas. Look, the number one patron far and away is Iran. Since the late 1980s, since the birth of Hamas, it has been Iran that has provided hundreds of millions of dollars. They've provided the weapons, the rockets, the ammunition, the drones more recently, the know-how for the creation of these tunnels. And in fact, even more recently, the technological warfare skills that Hamas uses to try to jam Iron Dome, that miraculous air defense system that shoots down many of Hamas's rockets from the sky. So you have Iran as probably the primary patron. Second would be the country of Qatar, which has pledged and provided tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas over the years. And that one, by the way, is very concerning because Israel allows Qatar to actually furnish aid directly in the Gaza Strip. And I think embedded in that process is a diversion mechanism that the Qataris, I think, have deliberately wielded. So they come in purporting to provide humanitarian assistance, and the next thing you know, that humanitarian assistance, building materials, et cetera, end up in the hands of Hamas, and they use that to build tunnels and the like. So Qatar is the second one. The third is Turkey, which has always been a head scratcher for a lot of folks, given that Turkey is it's a NATO ally. And the idea that it would be supporting Hamas, supporting a terrorist organization while under the umbrella of NATO is one that I think people have a hard time digesting. And then the last one, and most people are not aware of this, is the country of Malaysia. The Malaysians have become quietly a jurisdiction for Hamas to learn engineering and other weapons manufacturing tradecraft. And in fact, we've seen the Mossad take out Hamas operatives on the streets of Malaysia in recent years. But when we talk about ways to prevent these conflicts from erupting in the future, I think a really simple and straightforward solution is for the United States and the West to put pressure on these four countries to halt their assistance to Hamas. If that assistance were to stop, then you would see the drying up of funds. And then I think it would be a lot harder for Hamas to justify its periodic wars with Israel. So those are the two things that I think could give us some hope. But it's hard when Hamas is the sovereign in the Gaza Strip, that it exists per its charter to try to ensure the destruction of the state of Israel. Ideologically, it's not interested in changing that perspective. So the overwhelming likelihood is that we'll see more conflicts along these lines in the years ahead.
Jonathan, the media narrative around the 11-day war in May was that it began with Sheikh Jarrah and the Temple Mount. And you contend in your book that it actually has a lot more to do with the PA's cancellation of elections on April 30th. So I just wanted you to, take an opportunity to sort of explain why they're wrong about Sheikh Jarrah and Temple Mount and why you're right about the April 30th election.
I thank you for asking that question. It's still my favorite. So the Sheikh Jarrah story, for those who were watching, it popped up a lot in early May, and it was ultimately described by our media here, or many of our media outlets, as the ultimate cause of the war. It was a silly narrative, in my view, and I think silly is probably charitable. The narrative was that Israel was about to evict a number of Arab residents of Eastern Jerusalem. Sheikh Jarrah is the neighborhood that is near the Damascus Gate, right outside the old city. It's right near the American Colony Hotel for those who've stayed there. And basically the narrative was that Israel was just treating its Arab citizens poorly in Jerusalem. The real story behind this neighborhood is that before 1948, before the creation of the State of Israel, there were Jewish families that bought plots of land and built homes in Eastern Jerusalem, and they lived there and developed the land. And then in 1948 and 1949, Israel's War of Independence erupted, and the Jordanians, as we all know, conquered East Jerusalem. So the Jews that lived there were forced out. They were evicted, in fact, and Arabs moved in. And the Arabs stayed there through the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel reconquered this territory. And it was at that point that the Jewish families began a legal process of trying to reclaim these homes. And that legal process has been going on for the last 50 years. That is a remarkably long period of time. And what was happening was that the court case was winding its way through the Supreme Court right before the war. And so that fed the narrative that Israel was about to evict. I have to say, it's a strange narrative because it was not an eviction like, okay, well, we just decided we don't want these people to live here, but it was actually the result of a legal process through the Israeli court system, which I think really is beyond reproach. This is a legitimate legal system in Israel, and I don't think anybody can really criticize it for kind of taking these off-the-cuff decisions. The other thing that I'll just say before I get to elections is, the idea that a real estate dispute can cause war is a very silly thing to say, right? Guns cause wars, rockets cause wars, bombs cause wars, right? Not real estate disputes that are being worked out in a legal system that is respected internationally. Now, if you ask me, okay, well, so if that wasn't what started the war, what did? And my answer to that, quite simply, is that there were elections that were canceled 1 month before the war that I think really had spurred Hamas on to potentially launch a conflict. The story basically is this: that in September of 2020, we saw the signing of the Abraham Accords. Everybody remembers these are the historic peace agreements, normalization agreements between Israel, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. And it was at that moment that the Palestinians who'd been fighting one another, right? Hamas had been in control of the Gaza Strip since 2007, when they took that territory by force in a brutal civil war. They had been opposed to the West Bank Palestinian Authority led by the PLO. And the two sides have been at odds with one another ever since 2007. And so when they saw the Arab world come together and join hands with Israel, 4 countries, adding on already to what we already saw with Jordan and Egypt, there was, I think, cause for legitimate concern that the Palestinians had lost the narrative in the Arab world. They had lost the hearts and minds of the Arab world. So soon after they announced that there would be elections. Now, nobody took it seriously. Certainly the Trump administration didn't take it seriously. I'm not sure the Trump administration even noticed that the announcement had been made. But after the electoral victory of Joe Biden, we began to see some moves in this direction. And I actually can tell you that early on in the first couple of months of the Biden administration, I spoke to a couple of officials and I said, this is a huge mistake. If you let Hamas take part in the election, it means that you're allowing Hamas to play a role in the next government. And if you allow Hamas to take a role in the next government, you are going to violate a number of American laws, including laws that were put in place by a guy you may have heard of named Senator Joe Biden, who put in place laws that basically said that if Hamas takes part in these elections, it mandates a cut in American assistance to the Palestinian Authority, and it mandates a cut in political relations. So there was a crisis brewing by just allowing Hamas to take part in these elections. It was a huge mistake. It was an unforced error on the part of all that welcomed it. Now, the Biden administration early on said, look, who are we to tell the Palestinians how to vote or how to carry out an election? Look at our imperfect democracy. Look at what happened to us on January 6th. But that narrative slowly gave way, I think, to a recognition of the concerns voiced by Israel, as well as some of the pragmatic Arab states. And ultimately, Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, the president of the Palestinian Authority, stepped back from the brink. He canceled the elections. Now, I think there can be no doubt that Hamas was furious when he did that. And Hamas found that it had no recourse. There was no way to engage in a political process where they might be able to outduel the PLO and to win control over the Palestinian Authority through political means. So what does a terrorist group do when it is blocked from politics and it is still trying to win the hearts and minds of its people? Surprise, terrorist groups carry out terrorist attacks. And that's what they did. And so in my view, that is likely the real reason why the war erupted, not some real estate dispute dating back to the 1920s.
You mentioned the 4 countries that are supporting Hamas, and many people are aware that Hezbollah is Iran's proxy in Lebanon to Israel's north, but fewer people are aware of the relationship between Iran and Hamas in Gaza. Can you tell us a bit about the difference between the Iran-Hezbollah connection and the Iran-Hamas connection, and maybe also inform us a bit of how religious sectarianism might play a role?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, look, Hezbollah was created in the early 1980s. It was actually created by Iran and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC, as many of you may know, is sort of the expeditionary force of the Iranian regime. These are the sort of the top soldiers, not the rank and file. And their job is to spread the revolution wherever they can, the Islamic Revolution of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So they create this among their fellow Shiites in Lebanon. And there was sort of rich soil for it after a war with Israel. So they created a Shiite militia based in Lebanon with the goal of the destruction of the state of Israel. And Hezbollah has been largely subservient to Iran over the years. It is a patron-client relationship without question. Now, with Hamas, it's a little bit different, right? Hamas was actually born out of, I was talking about this with Stuart and Matt right before the discussion today. It was born actually out of a car accident that took place in December 1987. The funerals turned to protests, and the protests spread like wildfire across the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And the next thing you know, there is this organic uprising known as the First Intifada. And that goes on for several years. Out of the Intifada is born a splinter movement of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that is Hamas. Hamas slowly over time evolved into an organization that wasn't just, engaging in random acts of violence, but actually received the support of Iran, not in that patron-client kind of way where there was a direct relationship where one answered to the other, but more that Iran saw Hamas as a vehicle to attack Israel. They wanted to do it already, and Iran basically said, we'll give you the cash, we'll give you the weaponry, we'll give you the training, and then you do you, right? You go out there and do what you think is right. Now, over time, I would say Iran's influence has grown. It was actually Iran that taught Hamas how to engage in the practice of suicide bombings in 1993 and 1994. And then, of course, we saw the campaign of suicide bombings in the Second Intifada between 2000 and 2005. But this was an Iranian and actually Hezbollah. It was the two of them that introduced this practice to Hamas. But also, over time, the amount of financial assistance grew, the amount of training grew, and we saw Hamas train in places like Sudan and Syria. And so the relationship has grown over time. I would argue that today, Hamas's leaders still don't answer to Iran, but Iran has immense influence in terms of, when it introduces new weapon systems, when it brings its leadership for indoctrination to Iran. There is a close and continuing relationship, one that Iran values greatly, one that Hamas values greatly. And so it's led to sort of a symbiotic relationship, not the standard patron-client relationship, but you cannot ignore the fact that when you look at the evolution of Hamas over the years, that it would not be what it is without the Islamic Republic.
I want to zoom out for a moment and ask something of a historical question, which is connected to Gaza. How do you evaluate Ariel Sharon's 2005 disengagement from Gaza?
Look, it was a huge mistake, and not because it was a bad idea. You have to remember that when Sharon left Gaza, it was because he said, look, we can't be in control of 2 million Palestinians and also expect to be a Jewish state, right? We can't absorb the Gaza Strip. So let's leave it to the Palestinians to govern themselves. The problem is that he did not broker that agreement with the Palestinian Authority. He did not actually have something in place where he said, look, we're getting out, you take this, and then let's figure out how to keep things calm. Let's figure out how to keep things from blowing up. Because by then, Hamas was already the strongest faction in the Gaza Strip, even though the Palestinian Authority still technically controlled it. Now, what happened after that was even worse, because then you saw the Bush administration encourage elections between the Hamas and Fatah factions. They did that in 2006. All the polls showed that the Fatah faction would win. The Fatah faction lost. Hamas won, earning it the right to form a government. And it was at that point that the US and Israel and others, I think justifiably, stepped in and said, Abu Mazen, you can do whatever you want, but don't let go of control. And so there was gridlock within the Palestinian system through 2006. And then in 2007, Hamas, very similar to, I think, the way we saw the outbreak of war with Israel in May, Hamas decided to launch a war in the Gaza Strip. They conquered it by force. They killed more than 100 PLO fighters. They shot a number of other ones in their arms and legs to ensure permanent disability. It was a brutal civil war that I think, probably could have prevented had we not sort of just handed the Gaza Strip over to Hamas and then held elections that, were certainly, the outcome was by no means certain. And so I think there was a series of missteps, probably all motivated by the right thinking, if you will, right? The idea of, well, let's give the Palestinians more opportunity to govern themselves. The problem is you needed insurance all along the way. None of the steps to mitigate the kind of damage that we saw were ever taken. And it was I think a huge misstep, a huge mistake on the part of Sharon, but also Bush, who encouraged Sharon to take these steps.
You dedicate a chapter in your book to Unrwa, the UN Relief and Works Agency. How should the pro-Israel community address the issue of Unrwa with the Biden administration? I believe you think that we should end Unrwa. Is that your position? And is a campaign for resettlement in third countries possible?
So look, UNRWA needs to be ended. This is the UN Relief and Works Agency. This is the only agency that I'm aware of outside the High Commissioner for Refugees that is dedicated to one population. And just to be clear, there were roughly 5 million refugees, there were roughly 800,000 refugees at the time of the 1948-49 war. And this agency was created to service them. Over time, they now claim that there are 5 million refugees today. That is an absurd assertion, because out of those 800,000 or so refugees from the time of the war, most of them have grown old and died. Okay, that's just biology, it's math. But what's happened is that the agency now recognizes the descendants of the original refugees, which means that the children, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, the great-great-grandchildren are all recognized as Palestinian refugees. So the population is only going to grow. And so it is a deeply corrupt organization in that it is not trying to solve a refugee problem, but actually sees refugees as clients, if you will. It's a growth portfolio. And it is truly sickening to see this, because the Palestinians still talk about the so-called right of return as one of the pillars of their engagement with Israel in a peace process, that the right of return needs to be settled. It's not 80,000, or rather 800,000 people that we're talking about resettling. It's 5 million. You cannot do this. It's impossible for Israel to accept these numbers and also to maintain its character as a Jewish state. So there is a huge problem there, and it continues to grow. I should also just note that UNRWA is known to have anti-Semitic passages in the textbooks that it uses. It's known to have Hamas members among the ranks of its teachers and its administrators. It's known to have tunnels that snake beneath a lot of its schools and other facilities. So it's a huge problem. I do think it needs to be defunded. I think it needs to be folded in to the High Commissioner for Refugees. I think it needs to be treated like any other refugee issue in the world. And I think, by the way, the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, et cetera, need to be redesignated. They can be identified as descendants of refugees, but they cannot be identified as refugees themselves. It is absurd to do that and harmful to do it. And so there needs to be a restructuring. Now, there are those who would say, look, if you take away this aid, you're going to cause irreparable harm to the Palestinian population, the destitute Palestinians that rely on this assistance that comes in. And to that, I would just say, fine, then let's transfer the aid that is normally provided through UNRWA. Let's transfer it to the Palestinian Authority. Let's transfer it to UNICEF. Let's transfer it to whatever agency is able to disperse it safely and responsibly, so that you're not cutting down on the services and you're not cutting down on the assistance. All you're doing is actually removing a malign actor from a deeply corrupt UN system.
We've touched on Iran, but I want to bring that more into the forefront. Secretary of State Tony Blinken recently stated about Iran's nuclear ambitions and commitment to nuclear non-proliferation. What we've seen in the last couple of days is that Iran right now does not seem to be serious about doing what's necessary to return to control, which is why we ended this round of talks in Vienna. What are your thoughts?
Well, look, there's an interesting sort of game of chicken that's going on here. The administration would love nothing more than to get back into the Iran deal. It is, of course, the signature foreign policy of Barack Obama. And I think probably more than anything, it was an attempt to kick the can down the road on the nuclear problem, with the hope that maybe Iran would become more moderate or pragmatic over time. And I think, you know, realists in Israel don't ever see that happening. And it was a huge, obviously, it was quite a battle. I'm sure within this community of Zionist rabbis, I'm sure there was some dispute. But what, you know, ultimately what happened, of course, is Donald Trump pulled out of the deal. You know, he decried the deal from the moment he became a candidate, and gave it a little bit of time to see if it could be fixed among our allies. Some of the problematic elements of the deal were, in fact, addressed in private negotiations, as I understood it, but they didn't finish in time, and Donald Trump pulled the rug out from under them, spiked the deal, and then started to apply, you know, what he called maximum pressure on Iran. That maximum pressure worked by all accounts. It really, it knocked the wind out of the Iranians in terms of their accessible cash reserves. From what I understand, they went from, you know, $150 billion in accessible cash to under $5 by the time Trump left office. And right now, the administration is engaging in a controversial effort to try to revive the deal. The leaders are not the same in Iran. We have a new president that has come in, who is, I think, less willing to negotiate, even at a more basic level. And so the administration is desperate to get a deal. They appear even right now to be willing to offer more concessions in exchange for less restrictions on the nuclear program, what my colleague Mark Dubowitz calls more for less. It's not a good, I don't think it's a good situation for the United States to be in. And I don't think it's a good situation for the Israelis to be in, because the Israelis have made it clear that they will take action if they see Iran approaching what we broadly describe as the zone of immunity, where they would be within sort of striking distance, if you will, of building that bomb. And then once that bomb's made, then Israel can't strike, right? Israel will find itself in handcuffs because it doesn't want a reprisal. So the Israelis are watching very carefully. The Iranians are inching slowly but surely toward that nuclear weapon, all the while insisting that they don't want to develop a nuclear weapon. And it's what's dangerous is that the US and Israel are not aligned right now. They want to be, but I think their goals here are very different, and we've got a new crisis brewing. If I didn't know any better, I would say that 2022 could be the year where all of this drama is finally settled. But I don't say that with any glee. I think that there will be tough decisions ahead for both the US and Israel, and there will be trying days for the US-Israel relationship as a result.
Jonathan, congregants approach us and ask us questions about articles they read in the media. One question that I anticipate some might be getting is, 3 years later, was Trump's decision to pull out of the JCPOA in 2018 an even wiser decision than we realized at the time?
It was brilliant and stupid. It really was. I mean, I can't tell you that I have to pick one, because I can't. On the one hand, I think that putting the pressure on Iran was absolutely the right thing to do. This regime was hamstrung. It was less emboldened under Trump because of his unpredictability, because of his tough rhetoric, because of the maximum pressure, sanctions pressure, et cetera. It was stupid because he didn't have a plan B, so to speak. He didn't put anything in place other than American sanctions. He didn't have agreements with the rest of the world on how to move forward. And so what happened was that as soon as Biden came in, he began to reverse the pressure and all the policies that Trump had put into place. So there wasn't structure. There wasn't sort of an organized process that the Biden administration could inherit and work with. It was just, it was unilateral US pressure, which is easier to unwind. Now, there are things that the Trump administration did where some of the nuclear entities that it had been initially designated, sanctioned under U.S. Law. They could have been repealed because they only related to the nuclear program. The Trump administration actually also proved that they were involved in terrorist activity as well, making it a lot harder to unwind some of these sanctions. So there were some structures in place that I think you have to give Trump credit for. But I think the takeaway for me from all of this was that American foreign policy is giving the Middle East whiplash. And by the way, not just Israel and not just Iran. I actually remember talking to an Emirati official several years ago. He said, look, we respect your democracy, but we don't want every 4 or 8 years to have to recalibrate everything because you have a new guy that came in and he decided to turn things on their head. We need to get back to a place, and this isn't a criticism of Trump or Biden, maybe it's a criticism of both of them together. We need to find a way to play, I'll use a football reference, we have to play between the 40-yard lines. We have to find a way of keeping our foreign policy centrist. There was a time when we were engaged in the Cold War where that was absolutely the case. When you went from Democrat to Republican back to Democrat again, the foreign policy didn't shift demonstrably. But right now it is a pendulum and it is giving people whiplash. And that's my biggest problem. It wasn't so much that Trump did it. It's just that I think, when we go back and forth like this, our allies don't like it. And our enemies, they are exploiting the differences amongst us. And, I think that's not where we should be.
You alluded to 2022, and you said that you don't await that with glee. And I think I know what you might be referring to. I just want to know, what does it look like the day or the week after if Israel does attack Iran?
So it really all depends on the attack. And, we've done a lot of thinking about this. If it is a conventional attack, then, you're looking at a regional war. Where if Israel's fingerprints are directly on a jet fighter strike on, nuclear facilities, it's very likely that you'll see Hezbollah respond. You'll see Iran respond itself with longer range rockets and missiles. You could see the Houthis in Yemen doing the same with their new capabilities, Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, and of course, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, along with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And you could see a wide range of actors striking Israel all at once, a multi-front war where Iron Dome could be overwhelmed. And it would be very, very difficult. But there are other things that are hybrid activities. And I did devote actually a whole chapter in the book to this, what the Israelis call the war between wars, or Hamilchama ben Hamilchamot. They call it the Mabam in Israel. And what this is an asymmetric campaign where Israel continues to strike at assets inside of Iran, Iranian assets in Syria, Iranian assets in Iraq on occasion, Iranian assets on the high seas, Iranian nuclear scientists inside Iran, Iranian nuclear facilities inside Iran, Al-Qaeda figures inside Iran. And it has been a grueling, just a 12-round title fight between Israel and Iran. And I could imagine that, that there could be actions taken, cyber actions in particular, that could, that Israel could decide to undertake with the idea of weakening Iran's nuclear program, setting it back further. Of course, these are things that Israel's already done. Stuxnet, if you remember, and another cyber tool called Olympic Games have been used. There have been other cyber attacks that have been less public that Israel has deployed. And so I would expect there to be a range of things that we could see from Israel. But the idea of just bombing it, knowing the kinds of responses, and by the way, it's important to note, Iran created or fostered these terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas, not just because they want the proxies to fight Israel every couple of years, but they are also insurance policies for when Iran tries to make a dash for a bomb, knowing that if Israel attacks them, that they have these forward deployed military forces that can do grave damage to Israel should Iran encourage them to do so. So these are the sorts of things. I have to say, it's never been easy to be an Israeli war planner. It's got to be a lot harder right now, looking at the threat from Iran, it is without question the foremost challenge to Israel is the threat from Iran.
I want to encourage our colleagues to write any questions that they may have. I do have a few more questions, but I will bring forward your questions if you write them. One of the things that struck me as I read your book, Jonathan, was how the Syrian civil war has impacted regional dynamics. With the conveyance of Iranian arms and the presence of the Russians, what's actually going to happen with Syria?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think my general sense in Syria is that Assad has won the day. He survived, and he survived primarily because Iran propped up his regime. Russia propped up his regime. Hezbollah actually was deployed to Syria and helped prop up the regime. The problem is that Iran, I think, has really exploited the fog of war. Of course, I mean, don't forget that there are a bunch of Sunni actors and others that also exploited the fog of war, and that led to the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other radical groups that ravaged the country and really tore it apart. But now, as the country sits in ashes, there are still, of course, sporadic fights that are taking place throughout the country. But as the country lays in ashes now, Iran has been using it, and actually has been using it since 2013, 2014, to transfer what the Israelis previously called game-changing weapons to Lebanon. So it's a transit point. When the Israelis talked about game-changing weapons, what they actually meant, and today they continue to target them almost every night, are Iranian-provided precision-guided munitions, or PGMs. And these PGMs are extremely dangerous because PGMs, first of all, enable Israel's enemies to potentially attack their high-value targets within 5 or 10 yards of where they intended. So that means the Dimona nuclear reactor, the chemical plant in Haifa, the Kiryat, the sort of Pentagon of Israel in Tel Aviv, the Azrieli towers. I mean, you name it, right? Any of this sort of large symbolic targets or even military targets of Israel could be targeted very precisely, as opposed to the kinds of rockets that we've seen up until now, which have been unguided and imprecise. The other thing that worries Israeli war planners and really what motivates Iran to do this is these weapons can potentially evade Iron Dome. They have evasive measures that allow them to go up, down, left, right, while they're being stalked by missile defense. And it's unclear at this point whether Iron Dome can neutralize them properly, but it's also hard for us to know how Israel would be able to discern if, for example, Hamas or Hezbollah fired 100 rockets into Israeli airspace. How would Israel know which one is a PGM and which one isn't? And so there are very new dynamics that are going to be introduced into the next rounds of conflict as a result of Iranian largesse and Iranian engineering and Iranian assistance to groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. And so this was a painful round of fighting, this most recent war that I've written about here. But I would say we've got a little taste of what may come if PGMs are introduced into the battlefield. Right now, we believe Hezbollah has maybe a few dozen or a few hundred PGMs. It's unclear whether Hamas has any, but we know that Iran is working around the clock to provide its proxies with these weapons. And that is, of course, of serious concern.
We've talked about Iran. I just want to touch on Turkey, especially in light of something you mentioned as a reminder that Turkey is a NATO ally. What could be the optimal strategy of the US and the EU toward Turkey, given, among other things, its continued sponsorship of Hamas?
Well, look, I mean, I'll just say that Turkey has become a state sponsor of terrorism over the years. I had very little hope for this regime. It reminds me in some ways of kind of the early years of the Islamic Republic of Iran. It actually was responsible. I was involved in a court case during which the Turks helped Iran evade sanctions at the height of the nuclear program, $20 billion in illicit finance. You also saw Turkey open its borders on its southeast flank to allow for jihadists to flow into the Syrian battlefield, and many of them went on to fight for ISIS. Turkey has supported Al-Qaeda in Syria. Turkey, has been a champion of the Taliban over the last couple of years. One gets a sense that there's really no bad actor that this government won't support. And in the meantime, this government in Turkey is also, they bought the Russian S-400 system, which actually now has it under sanctions by the US government. This is an air defense system that the United States has prohibited its allies from acquiring, and Turkey's gone ahead and done it anyway. So I think we're at a bad point. We're at a low point with the Turks right now. It's not talked about very often, but I think it's an incredibly important jurisdiction to watch, especially when we think about the next generation of leadership. It'd be one thing if Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the current president, when he's gone, whatever he leaves, that somebody else comes in their place and they resume the Ataturk tradition of a democratic Turkey. I'm not convinced that that's where we are. I fear that the democratic institutions of Turkey have been gutted by this current government, and it's Islamist in nature. It's often anti-American in nature. It's anti-Israel in nature. It's anti-Semitic in nature. The Turkish people, totally different story, but the government continues to just erode the state from the inside.
Jonathan, I'd like to share some questions from our colleagues, and one of them circles back to the Israel-Palestinian issue. How accurate is the political relationship between the PA and Hamas as portrayed in Fauda?
In Fauda, the Israeli PA relationship in Fauda, Captain Ayub was, I guess, the Fauda character, the Israeli character that interfaces with the PA. It's fairly accurate in the sense that there is good security cooperation. The PA, it needs Israel in order to survive, in fact. That were it not for Israeli intelligence and Israeli coordination with the security forces, you would have probably already seen Hamas overrun the West Bank. And so as much as the PA may not love Israel, I'm not sure that the PA sent forces to light a Chanukiah with the IDF this year. What one gets a sense is that they need one another. It's a matter of survival. It's self-preservation for the two of them. So those sorts of that kind of coordination, I think, is ongoing. And of course, Captain Ayub in Fauda is a fluent Arabic speaker. And you have a lot of them in Israel, especially within the Shabak, the Shin Bet. And so the coordination within is strong. It's not always loved, but it certainly has helped keep stability, continuity in the region. And I'll just say, by the way, that there are a lot of folks in the kind of the pro-Israel community that want to topple the PA. They want to topple the Assad regime in Syria. They want to let Lebanon collapse as it struggles under mountains of debt. The senior Israeli officials that I've talked to, they have no love for any of these governments or regimes, but what they want is stability, because they have so much instability already around the region that lighting more fires in other places is not what they want. So that explains the kind of good relationship that exists between the PA and the relevant officials within the security sector.
Another question from a colleague regarding the renewal or potential renewal of the JCPOA. What do Russia and China really want? Do Russia and China really countenance the existence of a nuclear Iran, or are they just playing some kind of game that's just anti-American?
Look, they don't want Iran to go nuclear. I think Russia in particular really doesn't want Iran to go nuclear, because Russia and Iran are actually competing to a certain extent in the Syrian theater. I think Russia would probably like it if Iran left already. And just allowed them to maintain a modicum of control there without having all these weapon systems going through that Israelis are blowing up every night. And so there's a certain amount of tension that exists. And so I don't think that they welcome or particularly relish the idea of a nuclear Iran. But they also really like to stick it to the United States. And that is a primary motivation, right? That these are, great power competitions or peer power competitions, whatever you want to call it. And so they often choose the other side and they antagonize the United States. That's unfortunately where we are. Russia, I have to say, by all accounts, it continues to be a thorn in the side of the US, but it's a lot weaker it's not a great power. It's not even a peer. China, on the other hand, a lot more concern here in Washington about China, the rise of China, and the kinds of alliances that it is trying to build, and by the way, into finance, right? That they have a very transactional approach to business and to politics. And so they're forging relationships based on antipathy toward the United States.
One of the things we spoke about right before we began the webinar was how quickly you were able to turn around this book and really set the stage for what's going to be a second round of discussions or discourse around this. Do you have any insights that you can offer us in terms of how we can approach the media and its inability to cover this topic or potential war in the future correctly?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy thing to just sort of say, well, just say this and you'll be fine. That's not the way this media environment works. I mean, but to be clear, I mean, I wrote this book faster than any book I'd written prior for exactly this reason. I mean, not to arm the community necessarily, but to begin to set the record straight a bit on what went wrong, and kind of to take a fresher look, or at least with the benefit of hindsight, to be able to look back at what happened and to see things a little bit differently than they were portrayed. I think that, first of all, to be able to explain those mistakes and to be able to explain them clearly to those that continue to try to perpetuate these erroneous narratives, I think is really important. If people start off with mistaken ideas and you can debunk them, well, that kind of ends the conversation right there in terms of their credibility. So if they're spouting these broken narratives, then call them out, and it changes the trajectory of a conversation quickly. But the thing that this is my third book on the Palestinians. I've written 4. The other one was on Al-Qaeda early on in my think tank career. But I continue to write about the Palestinians only because I think they are such an underanalyzed political system. And that's actually an amazing thing to say out loud, because the coverage of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is saturated, right? I mean, there are hundreds or thousands of reporters that cover this, and people are like sort of very partisan about it, and they're arguing about it on a regular basis. And yet, most people aren't aware of the fact that Mahmoud Abbas is 16 years into a 4-year term. They're not aware of the fact that the Palestinian Authority pilfers most of the $600 million a year that we provide to the PA. They're not aware of the fact that a civil war is still ongoing between the Fatah faction in the West Bank and the Hamas faction in the Gaza Strip. The dynamics of all of this are lost. And what's remarkable to me is that they're lost on our community, on the pro-Israel community. And what I just don't understand is why the focus has always been on Israel alone, right? I feel like this is what we teach our kids, and we teach, we continue to teach, which is, this is Israel, this is the history of Israel, these are the ancestors of Israel. And by the way, today, modern Israel, look at their army, it's got, it's egalitarian, it welcomes gay people, it welcomes people with special needs, right? All the wonderful things about Israel, but that's not useful in a debate when war breaks out. What actually it is, it's defense, it's deflection, right? It's not a counter, right? And so you want to say that Israel's got flaws? Of course it has flaws. Every country in the world has flaws. It's not a perfect place, but Israel takes on so much more criticism than any other country that I've ever seen. And I think one of the reasons why is because its defenders, its proponents, don't actually make similar charges back at those that are trying to vilify Israel. And so I continue to be fascinated by the Palestinian political arena because there's just so little out there. It's just sort of accepted as this David versus a Goliath. But nobody studies the dynamics. Nobody looks at their own history, which is, God, it's got its own problems. And in my view, it's worth writing about, and that's why I have.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I just want to turn it over to Rabbi Weinblatt for our closing.
Thank you. Thank you both, Matt, for just a wonderful series of questions. And Jonathan, thank you so much for all that you've shared with us. I think on that last note that you ended, it's really part of what the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition is all about. And that is that we find that it's so critical for rabbis to try and get these messages out. I went to Israel with a group of rabbis from our community shortly after the end of the war with Hamas, and was really shocked by how many of the rabbis who traveled with me just accepted the Palestinian narrative based on the superficial reports that came out of the media that they had seen. So I think your work is so very, very important, and we're really very pleased to be able to share this with others so that we can bring that to the fore. Jonathan, are there any last words you want to share? I mean, I think that last comment really summed up a lot, but if there's anything else you wanted to share, we'll give you the final word.
No, I mean, I'll just say thank you very much for having me. I appreciate your leadership, Rabbi, and Matt, appreciate very much the thoughtful questions. The book's available on Amazon, and it makes a great present. No longer Hanukkah, but I don't know. I don't know, sending it back with your college kid when they go back to campus.
Thank you. It's also, by the way, we also put it on the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition website as well, so that colleagues can get it from there. So again, we thank you, Jonathan. We're looking, by the way, to have other webinars in the new year, including, hopefully, God willing, it's Hashem, an in-person conference in the Washington in the coming months. And so please look for that, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you as well, Jonathan. Thank you to everyone. Good day.
Thank you.